All right, let's talk about glute training. When I say glutes, I'm really referring to a group of three distinct muscles: the gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, and gluteus minimus. Collectively, these three muscles perform hip extension. The glutes also have two secondary functions that we call hip abduction and hip horizontal abduction. If you want to be thick with multiple C's, then I suggest focusing the majority of your volume on the glute max, since it's the largest of the glute muscles. The glute max is best trained with hip extension and horizontal abduction exercises, which I am going to split into two categories: compound and isolation. Compound movements are when multiple joints are experiencing angular displacement throughout the exercise, whereas isolation movements have only one joint experiencing angular displacement. Let's check out how you would perform your compound movements to best grow your glute max. As I'm sure you've heard me say before, muscles grow better when we apply maximum resistance in the stretch position. Since the glute max acts to extend the hip, it will be most stretched when we are in a high degree of hip flexion. So if you want big glutes, focus the majority of your volume on exercises that load hip extension and get you into high degrees of hip flexion. Some examples of that are leg presses with your feet high on the platform, step-ups, glute kickbacks, deadlifts, and squats. You may notice that many of these can also be considered quad exercises, and you would be right about that. However, as I talked about in my quad training video, we can perform movements in a way that biases a certain muscle by creating greater angular displacement at the joint upon which the target muscle acts. Since work is equal to force times displacement, creating more displacement forces the target muscle to do more work during the exercise. Let's look at a leg press as an example. To train the quads, we would want to bend our knee as much as possible, since the quads act primarily on the knee joint. To bias the glutes, however, we would want to move our hip joint as much as possible. In order to accomplish this, you would put your feet higher on the platform. To get even more glute growth, you can get the glute max into an even deeper stretch by starting out in a greater degree of hip flexion. In other words, you should lean forward more by bringing the seat back up as far as it goes. You can also apply this concept to other exercises like the squat. Here you see me doing a quad biased squat with a large degree of knee flexion, whereas in this video I am performing a squat with less knee flexion and greater hip flexion. Both of these are viable ways of squatting, but the first will train the quads better and the second will train the glutes and spinal erectors better. When writing your program, I would suggest including two glute-focused compound movements, one being a squatting movement pattern and the other being a hinging movement pattern like the deadlift. Now that we've talked about compounds, let's check out some isolation movements that are good for the glutes. The first isolation I would recommend is the horizontal abduction machine. If you recall earlier, I mentioned that the glutes are composed of three different muscles, all of which can be targeted with horizontal abduction depending on how you perform the exercise. If you want to target the glute max, then you should lean forward like you see me doing here. This puts you into a greater degree of hip flexion, which better aligns the fibers of the glute max to perform horizontal abduction. If you want the fibers of the glute med and the glute min to perform the movement, then you should lean back. At this point, it starts to become more regular abduction rather than horizontal abduction. Really what you're doing here is simply varying the degree of hip flexion that you're in, and by changing this, you change which muscle is in a position best aligned to move the femur away from the midline of the body. The second isolation movement I would suggest for the glutes is a hip thrust. I'm a bit hesitant to include this one since the resistance curve is the opposite of what we want for ideal muscle growth. Hip thrusts have the least resistance when the glutes are most stretched, and the greatest resistance when the glutes are most shortened. However, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to include at least one movement that biases either the mid or shortened range in your program, so feel free to include these, but I would suggest using them secondary to a lengthened bias movement like a squat or deadlift. Moving on to general recommendations, I would suggest doing anywhere between 4 and 20 sets per week of glute-specific exercises. This range is very wide because it really depends on what the rest of your program looks like. The glutes are still going to be highly active in many quad and hamstring exercises, so if you have a lot of those in your program, then sticking to lower volume for glute-specific exercises is probably a good idea. I would suggest training compound glute movements 1 to 2 times per week and glute isolation movements up to 3 times per week. The reason being that compounds impose a high degree of systemic fatigue and are rather difficult to recover from, whereas isolations do not. I would suggest using anywhere between 30 and 85% of your 1 rep max for the exercises that you choose, performing your sets somewhere in the 5 to 30 rep range. As I've said before, muscle growth will be equivalent with these loads and rep ranges so long as you are training equivalently close to failure in each scenario. With that being said, some exercises like squats and deadlifts are more conducive to lower rep ranges due to their higher cardiorespiratory demand. We want our glutes to be the limiting factor in each set, not our cardiorespiratory system. Isolation movements get rather difficult to perform in lower rep ranges, so doing them with higher reps is probably a good idea. Pick the variations you want to use and keep them in your program as long as they remain feeling fresh. And keep a training log to ensure your performance is improving over time, adding sets, reps, load, or some combination thereof, and you're on your way to being thick with lots of C's. Enjoy the dumpy.